Neva, from this moment on, we have separate finances. I'm done supporting you and your little freeloader, my husband declared. I calmly agreed, and when my mother-in-law's relatives came over, as usual, to eat for free and looked in the kitchen, they screamed at what they saw. Tatiana closed the last report and leaned back in her leather chair. Outside her downtown office window, the streetlights were already coming on, and on the desk next to her computer lay a folder with documents she'd brought from home. Personal papers, deeds to 3 commercial properties in the historic district, bank statements and rental agreements signed 5 years ago. The numbers in the statements were impressive, but Tatiana never bragged about them. The engineering firm occupied 2 floors in an old brick building that had once been a textile mill. High ceilings, large windows, modern equipment, and 23 employees. Tatiana knew each one by name, remembered who had children, who had health problems, who needed help. She was a demanding but fair boss. People respected her not for money, but for honesty. If she promised a bonus, she paid it. If she said a project was important, she explained why. She never yelled, never humiliated, never blamed others for her mistakes. The money for the business came from Uncle Michael. He died childless and left everything to her, his only niece who had cared for him during the last 2 years of his life. Uncle Michael was a strange man. He spent his whole life saving, investing in real estate, but lived modestly in a 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. When doctors told him he had cancer, he refused treatment, just sat at home reading books and drinking tea with raspberry jam. Tatiana came every day after work, cooked, cleaned, talked with him. Uncle Michael told stories from his youth, taught her to be careful with people, not to trust words, to verify facts. Tanya, he would say, sitting in his old chair by the window, remember one thing. People change when they find out you have money, even the closest ones. Don't show anyone how much you have. Live modestly, test people with time. You'll see who's with you for you, and who's with you for your wallet. Tatiana remembered. 7 years ago, she had just divorced her first husband, was raising little Arthur on her own, and worked as a chief engineer at a manufacturing plant. The salary was decent, but not luxurious. A rented 1-bedroom apartment, no mortgage, daycare for her son. The ordinary life of an ordinary woman. When Uncle Michael died, the notary read the will. 3 commercial properties downtown, an apartment on the outskirts, bank deposits. In total, it came to about $70 million. Tatiana sat in the notary's office and couldn't believe her ears. The inheritance changed her life. She was able to open her own engineering firm, hire talented specialists, and rent out the properties. She bought a 3-bedroom apartment in a good neighborhood for herself and Arthur, but didn't tell anyone about the scale of her wealth. She explained to colleagues at her old job that she'd received a small inheritance and decided to risk starting her own business. She told her parents, who lived in another state, the same thing. Only the notary, her accountant, and the bank manager knew about the money. Even Arthur, now 13, had no idea his mother owned real estate worth tens of millions. He thought his mom was just a successful engineer with her own small firm. Her second husband, Stanley, also didn't know about the money. They met 6 months after she received the inheritance at an industrial equipment expo. Tatiana had come there for work, looking for a supplier of special fasteners for a new project. She was walking between booths, studying catalogs, when a man in a sharp suit approached her, tall, broad-shouldered, with a confident smile. He introduced himself as Stanley, a procurement specialist for a large company, offered to help with her selection, spoke professionally with expertise, and joked appropriately. Tatiana felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in a long time. After the expo, he asked for her phone number, called 2 days later, invited her for coffee. Tatiana agreed. They met in a quiet cafe near downtown. Stanley talked about work, about how he dreamed of opening his own business, but was still saving for startup capital. He asked about her. Tatiana cautiously said she worked as an engineer, had recently opened a small firm, and was raising her son alone. Stanley nodded with understanding, said he respected women who achieved everything on their own. He didn't ask about her ex-husband, didn't pry, just listened, looked attentively, smiled. They met several more times. Stanley invited her to the theater, exhibitions, nice restaurants. He paid himself, wouldn't let Tatiana even reach for her wallet. He said it was his duty as a man. He gave flowers, walked her home, didn't impose himself. Tatiana was tired of loneliness and constant responsibility. She wanted to relax, trust someone, feel cared for. Stanley seemed reliable, didn't drink, didn't smoke, worked a stable job. He spoke beautifully about family values. After 3 months, he met Arthur. The boy was 6 years old then. He looked warily at the strange man in their home. Stanley brought a construction set, sat on the floor with Arthur, and started building together. He didn't baby talk, didn't pretend, just built and explained how things worked. Arthur warmed up to him. Tatiana watched them and thought maybe this was a chance at a normal family. 6 months later, Stanley proposed. Modestly, without excessive fanfare. He came over one evening with a bouquet of white roses, got down on one knee right in the kitchen while Tatiana was making dinner. He said he wanted to be there, help, care, that Arthur needed a father and Tatiana needed a reliable shoulder. She agreed, not from passion, but from exhaustion. She wanted to stop pulling everything alone. They had a quiet wedding without much fuss, registered at City Hall, celebrated at a restaurant with a dozen guests. Stanley's mother Eleanor, his sister Joanne, a few friends. Tatiana invited her parents from out of state, a couple of work friends. Stanley gave a toast, promised to love and cherish. Eleanor sat with a satisfied face, whispering something to Joanne. Tatiana smiled, drank champagne, but inside felt somehow anxious. They married quickly. She honestly said she had a son and a small business. She kept quiet about the scale. Why? She remembered Uncle Michael's words. Test a person with time. Understand who they really are. Stanley moved into her 3-bedroom apartment in a good neighborhood, which Tatiana had bought with part of the inheritance. He admired the renovation, convenience, location. He asked mortgage or bought outright. Tatiana answered evasively, "There's a loan." He nodded, didn't press further. She didn't correct him. Let him think they lived in a mortgaged apartment. Easier that way. The first 6 months were like a honeymoon. Stanley drove them around in his car, helped Arthur with homework, cooked on weekends, planned evenings, took them to movies, bought ice cream. Tatiana relaxed, thought she'd made the right choice. Home became cozier, warmer. Arthur got used to Stanley, called him just by his first name, without tension. Tatiana worked, came home in the evening, and dinner was already on the table. Stanley told jokes, made Arthur laugh, hugged Tatiana. It seemed like it would always be this way, but gradually small things started happening. Sometimes he'd stay late at work and come home smelling not of his cologne, but of expensive foreign perfume. Then suddenly he urgently needed money for car repairs. Supposedly the engine was knocking, needed diagnostics. Tatiana gave it without asking. A month later, more money needed. For a gift for his boss, for a corporate party, for new winter tires. Tatiana silently transferred money to his card without going into details. Then friends appeared who came to visit and stayed until midnight. Loud, noisy, smelling of beer and cigarettes. They sat in the living room, watched football, yelled when someone scored. Tatiana set the table, sliced sausage and cheese, made sandwiches, served beer. The friends left after midnight, leaving mountains of cigarette butts on the balcony, empty bottles, greasy plates. Stanley promised to clean up in the morning, but forgot. Tatiana cleaned, and then his mother came. Eleanor appeared in their lives suddenly, like snow in July. Rang the doorbell on a Wednesday evening without warning. Stood at the threshold with 2 bags, smiling widely. Said she was in the neighborhood and decided to drop by. Brought apples from her garden. Tatiana invited her in, set the table, and Eleanor sat down like she owned the place. She looked around critically, asked who did the renovation. Tatiana answered that they'd hired a crew. Her mother-in-law shook her head. Must have been expensive. Could have done it yourselves. Dinner was tense. Eleanor tried every dish and commented, "Soup's too thin, meatballs are dry, salad without mayo. How is that even edible?" Stanley was silent, ate, occasionally nodded to his mother. Tatiana cleared the table, washed dishes. Her mother-in-law watched, advised how to properly wash cups so there wouldn't be streaks. Eleanor left late after 10. At the threshold, she hugged Stanley, patted Tatiana on the shoulder. "Well done, good housewife," and added that she'd start coming by more often now. So convenient. Nearby, after all. Tatiana smiled, nodded, but inside something clenched. From then on, Eleanor started coming every Wednesday and Sunday without calling, with bags of groceries that she supposedly brought as gifts, but which turned out to be token items. A couple of apples, a loaf of bread, a bag of cheap cookies. But she always ate with appetite. Tatiana cooked borscht, roasts, pies, salads. Her mother-in-law would sit at the table, taste, grimace, not enough salt. Too much pepper, meat's tough. Stanley ate silently, didn't interfere. Stanley's sister Joanne came less often, but strategically, always before holidays when the fridge was bursting with food. She brought 2 noisy children who ran around the apartment, screamed, turned everything upside down. Joanne sat on the couch with her phone, didn't discipline them, didn't correct them, said children should develop freely without restrictions. Arthur hid in his room, closed the door. Tatiana saw how he tensed, how he shrank when he heard their voices. Tatiana silently set the table, cooked for 3 hours, listened to her mother-in-law's comments about the undersalted soup and tough meat. Eleanor ate, packed containers to take home, left satisfied. Joanne wasn't shy either, took pies, salads, jars of jam. She said the children needed homemade food. Store-bought wasn't healthy. Stanley agreed, nodded. "Of course, take some, Mom." Arthur sat in his room, pretended to study, but Tatiana saw how he tensed when Eleanor loudly asked, "Is this boy always so quiet? Doesn't he spend too much time on his phone? Maybe should take him to a doctor." Or Joanne would add, "My kids have such energy and this one's so pale weak. Should put him in sports or he'll grow up to be a wimp." Tatiana clenched her fists under the table, but stayed silent. Didn't respond, didn't snap back, just observed, remembered every phrase, every word, every look. She accumulated information like you accumulate evidence before a trial. Stanley didn't stand up for Arthur. He generally tried not to get involved in his mother's conversations, even when she started criticizing Tatiana's work. What kind of engineering firm is that? Ridiculous. A woman should stay home, take care of the household, not disappear into offices. Tatiana was silent, not because she was enduring it. She was observing, recording in her mind every phrase, every situation, every detail that revealed the true face of her husband's relatives. Stanley started changing after the first year of marriage. He became irritable, nitpicky. If Tatiana stayed late at work, he'd make scenes. "Where were you running around?" If she bought Arthur something expensive, new sneakers or a tablet for school, Stanley would grimace. "You're spoiling him. He'll grow up entitled. And anyway, where's the money from? I don't see you earning that much." "I told you I have a business," Tatiana answered calmly. "Business," Stanley snorted. "A company with 20 people. What kind of business is that?" He had no idea that the building where his own company rented office space belonged to Tatiana. She deliberately didn't tell him, waited, tested. And the further it went, the more convinced she became that she wasn't wrong in her suspicions. In the summer, when Tatiana went to the coast with Arthur, Stanley stayed in the city. "Work," he said. Tatiana left calmly, but asked her assistant Olivia, who lived in the next building, to keep an eye on the apartment. Olivia was a sharp girl with a law degree who'd been working at Tatiana's firm for only a year, but had become a trusted person. On the 3rd day of vacation, Olivia sent a message. "Tatiana, sorry to bother you, but yesterday evening I saw Stanley. He went into the building with a young woman. They were laughing. Is this my business or not? Tatiana replied briefly, "Thank you, this is important." She added that Olivia shouldn't worry, then put down her phone and looked at the ocean. Arthur was building a sand castle, enthusiastically carrying buckets of water. Strange, but Tatiana felt neither pain nor offense, only cold clarity. So that's how it is. Time to act. Returning from vacation, Tatiana didn't make scenes. Stanley met them at the station, helped with the suitcases, asked how they'd rested, kissed her on the cheek, smiled, acted like a loving husband. He said he'd missed them, that the house was empty, that he'd been waiting. Tatiana smiled, talked about the beach and excursions, showed photos on her phone, but was already making a plan. At night, while Stanley slept, she lay with open eyes, stared at the ceiling, and thought not about how to forgive him, but about how to protect herself and Arthur. How to do everything right, legally competent, without emotions and scandals. On Monday, she went to see her lawyer, Igor, a man approaching retirement, experienced, cynical, with a gray beard and tired eyes. He'd worked with Tatiana since she opened the firm, handled all documents, contracts, deals. He knew her as an honest, punctual client. When Tatiana entered the office, he looked up from his papers, nodded, offered tea. Tatiana declined, sat across from him, folded her hands on her lap, told him briefly without unnecessary emotion. Her husband was cheating. Her assistant saw him with a woman. She needed facts, evidence, documents. Igor listened silently, then chuckled. Classic. Want a divorce? Not yet, Tatiana answered. I want to prepare. Check what he's spending money on. Hire a private investigator. I need facts, photos, receipts, messages if possible. Everything that proves infidelity and misuse of family money. Igor nodded, wrote something in his notepad, asked how much time she had. Tatiana answered, a month, 2, however long it takes. The main thing is to gather the full picture. The lawyer promised to find a good detective, vetted, discreet. They agreed on a price. Tatiana paid cash and left the office. She felt calm. She'd taken the first step. 2 weeks later, Igor brought a folder. Thick, heavy, stuffed with papers. He laid it on the table in front of Tatiana and opened it. Photos, printouts of messages, bank statements. Tatiana flipped through pages, red-looked. Her face remained calm, but inside she felt cold. Stanley was renting an apartment for his mistress, a studio in a new building on the outskirts. The girl was 26, named Karina, worked as an administrator at a beauty salon. Long dyed hair, bright makeup, short dresses. In the photos, they were hugging, kissing, entering the building together. The detective had taken pictures at different times, morning, evening, night. Stanley came to her 2 or 3 times a week, stayed overnight. He told Tatiana at home that he was staying late at work, sleeping at a friend's, that a corporate party ran late. Then came receipts, grocery stores, restaurants, beauty salons, a jewelry store. Stanley bought Karina gold earrings, perfume, a designer bag. He paid her apartment rent, $2, $500 a month. Bought groceries, took her to cafes, movies, concerts. Over the last 6 months, he'd spent more than $30,000 on her. He took the money from their joint budget, the same one Tatiana regularly contributed to, thinking they lived as a family. It turned out Stanley had barely contributed to the household for the last 6 months. His salary went to his mistress, while Tatiana paid for groceries, utilities, clothes for all 3 of them, car repairs, gifts for his mother and sister on holidays. She even bought gas for his trips to his mistress with her own money, not knowing about it. The folder also had messages. The detective had somehow obtained screenshots from a messenger. Stanley wrote tender messages to Karina, promised they'd soon live together, that his wife didn't understand him, that the marriage was a mistake, that he'd married foolishly. Karina replied with emojis, asked for money for a new phone, a trip to the beach, a fur coat. Stanley promised, wrote that he needed time, that he didn't have money now, but would soon get a big order at work and receive a bonus. He lied at every step. "What are we going to do?" Igor asked when Tatiana closed the folder. She looked at him with a long gaze, then quietly said, "We'll wait. Let him dig himself deeper. I need him to be the first to suggest separate finances or say something that will let me leave with a clear conscience. Not that I destroyed the family, but that he did. Understand?" Igor understood, nodded with respect. He'd worked with Tatiana long enough to know this woman didn't make hasty decisions. She thought, planned, calculated options. And when she acted with certainty. Another month passed. Stanley started coming home later and later. Sometimes stayed overnight, supposedly at his friend Sergei's. Tatiana didn't ask, didn't reproach. Just nodded when he explained at the door that he'd stayed late at work, that his boss asked him to stay, that it was an urgent project. She saw how he lied, saw how his eyes darted, how his shoulders tensed, how he quickly went to the bathroom to wash off the foreign perfume. But she stayed silent, observed, collected facts. She methodically transferred money to a separate account Stanley didn't know about. She'd opened it before the marriage in her name, at a bank where they had no joint cards. Every week she transferred part of her salary, part of the rental income. First a little, then more. By the end of the month, she'd accumulated enough to live comfortably for 6 months, even if Stanley tried to retaliate financially. She prepared documents for the apartment, the business, the downtown properties, ownership certificates, rental agreements, property records. Everything had been registered before marriage, which meant it wasn't subject to division. They hadn't signed a prenuptial agreement. Stanley had refused himself. Back then, when Tatiana proposed it, he said it showed distrust, that they were family, that what kind of contracts could there be between people in love? Tatiana didn't insist. Now she understood why. He'd planned in case of divorce to claim everything. He thought the apartment was joint property, that the business was shared. He was wrong. She quietly, without fuss, changed the locks in the apartment. She called a locksmith on a weekday when Stanley was at work and Arthur was at school. The locksmith came quickly, changed the locks on the front door in an hour. She made new keys only for herself and Arthur. 2 sets. She left Stanley with the old keys. He didn't notice because he used the intercom. He'd call from downstairs. Tatiana or Arthur would open the door. He had keys but hadn't used them in a long time. Too lazy to walk up, he'd wait for the elevator, buzz the intercom. Tatiana checked all the documents again. The apartment, her property, bought before marriage with inheritance money. The downtown properties, also hers, inherited before marriage. The business, registered in her name before marriage. Almost no joint property. The car was registered to Stanley, but bought with his money before he met Tatiana. The furniture in the apartment, part bought by her before marriage. Part they bought together, but with her money. She had receipts. Igor said there wouldn't be problems. The divorce would go quickly. Stanley would get nothing. Tatiana prepared herself mentally, rehearsed in her head the conversation that sooner or later would have to happen. She knew Stanley would beg, cry, swear. She prepared not to give in. She remembered all his lies, all the humiliations, all the insults to Arthur. She wrote down on a piece of paper all the episodes, so she wouldn't forget, wouldn't forgive in a moment of weakness. She hid the sheet in a desk drawer at work. Reread it when doubts started creeping in. In early fall, Tatiana's firm got an unexpected order. A large company commissioned a project to reconstruct a production facility. The contract amount was several million. Work would last 6 months. Tatiana personally conducted negotiations, signed the contract, and came home that evening in high spirits. Arthur was doing homework in the kitchen. Stanley sat in the living room in front of the TV. Tatiana reheated dinner, set the table. Stanley ate without saying a word, then suddenly asked, "Listen, how are things at your work? I heard one of your clients went bankrupt." "No, everything's fine," Tatiana answered. Actually, I signed a major contract today. Stanley perked up. Major? How much? Enough not to worry for 6 months. He chuckled, but the interest in his eyes was obvious. Lately, he'd been asking more often about her work, about income. Tatiana guessed why. The mistress was demanding more attention and money. And Stanley was running out of money. Another week later, he came home gloomier than a storm cloud, threw his keys on the side table, went to the kitchen, poured himself water. Tatiana was making dinner, baking chicken with vegetables. Arthur sat in his room, but the door was ajar. Listen, Stanley began, I need money. Urgently. How much? Tatiana asked calmly without turning from the stove. 30,000. Borrowed from a friend. Need to pay back. $30,000. Tatiana smirked to herself. She knew it wasn't a loan. The mistress wanted a fur coat, or Stanley decided to rent her a better apartment. Okay, she said. I'll transfer it tomorrow. Stanley exhaled with relief. Thanks, I'll definitely pay you back. He didn't pay back, wasn't going to. Tatiana saw it in his face. The next day she transferred the money, but took a screenshot of the transfer and saved it in a separate folder with the rest of the evidence. That evening, Eleanor and Joan showed up without warning. As usual on Wednesday for dinner, Tatiana set the table, borscht, mashed potatoes, meatballs, salad. Eleanor ate and commented, Borscht is watery. You skimped on sour cream, huh? Joan chimed in, Yeah, Mom's borscht is thick, rich. This is like soup. Arthur sat at the table, ate silently, but Tatiana saw how he gripped his fork. Stanley pretended not to hear, finished his second helping, scrolled through his phone. Tatiana stood up, started clearing dishes, and Eleanor leaned back in her chair. So, Tanya, when are you going to have a second one? Stanley needs an heir. This one doesn't count, she nodded at Arthur. Tatiana froze with plates in her hands. There it was. Arthur went pale, lowered his eyes. Stanley didn't even look up from his phone. Joan giggled. Mom, you're so direct as always. But you're basically right, not blood family after all. Eleanor, Tatiana said quietly, putting the plates in the sink. Don't say that again. What's wrong? The mother-in-law sniffed. It's the truth. Poor Stanley. You hung such a burden on him. He's already supporting you, and now he has to feed someone else's kid. Stanley looked up from his phone, but said nothing. Tatiana looked at him with a long gaze. He looked away. That was enough. Dinner ended in tense silence. Eleanor and Joanne left half an hour later, dissatisfied with the lack of dessert. Stanley disappeared into the bedroom. Tatiana went into Arthur's room. The boy sat on the bed, hugging his knees. Mom, am I really a burden? He asked quietly. Tatiana sat next to him, hugged her son. No, you're the most important thing in my life, and no one has the right to tell you otherwise. But they said, they're stupid people. Soon you'll see it yourself. Arthur didn't understand, but nodded. Tatiana kissed him on the head and left. In the hallway, she took out her phone and wrote to Igor, It's time. Prepare divorce documents. You have everything you need. The next day, Tatiana returned from work at the usual time. Stanley sat on the couch, again on his phone. She reheated dinner, put a plate on the table for him, for herself, for Arthur. Stanley ate, pushed away his plate, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and suddenly said in a tense voice, Listen, we need to talk. About what? Tatiana asked calmly, finishing her salad. About money. About how we're living. She put down her fork, looked at him. I'm listening. Stanley sighed as if preparing for a difficult conversation, then blurted out, Honey, from this moment on, we have separate finances. I'm done supporting you and your little freeloader. Tatiana didn't blink. Arthur froze with a piece of bread in his hand, went pale. Stanley continued, gaining confidence. I'm the man, the breadwinner, and you're used to me paying for everything. The apartment, the car, food, everything's on me. It's time for you to contribute your share, because you're sitting there supposedly working, but there's zero result. Some business, an office with 3 rooms, and carrying your kid on my back. I'm tired of it. So starting tomorrow, everyone pays for themselves. I pay for me, you pay for you. And enough feeding everyone. How long can I keep treating my mom and sister? They come over, you cook for 3 hours. On my money, by the way. No more. Let them cook for themselves. Okay, Tatiana said calmly. Stanley expected a scandal, tears, outrage, but not this reaction. He was confused. So you agree? Yes. Separate finances, separate expenses. Starting tomorrow, I only pay for myself and Arthur. You pay for yourself and your guests. No complaints. Well, great then, Stanley muttered, not believing his luck. So we're agreed. Tatiana stood up from the table, cleared her plate and Arthur's. She left Stanley's plate. He looked at her with bewilderment. Dishes too. Everyone washes their own now. Exactly, Tatiana nodded. Separate finances include separate household duties. You eat, you wash. I eat, I wash. Stanley grimaced but said nothing. He got up, half-heartedly rinsed his plate, and went to the bedroom. Tatiana stayed in the kitchen with Arthur. The boy looked at her with wide eyes. Mom, what's happening? Justice, son. You'll see soon. The next day, Tatiana got up early, got Arthur ready for school, made breakfast, only for 2. Stanley came out of the bedroom, saw 2 place settings on the table, and was confused. What about me? Separate finances, Tatiana reminded him. Cook for yourself. Food's in the fridge, grains in the cupboard. Stove works. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Wanted to protest, but remembered he'd proposed all this himself yesterday. He muttered something under his breath, poured himself tea, and left for work hungry. Tatiana smiled. This was only the beginning. That evening, she came home with 2 small bags from the store. Inside, instant ramen, a loaf of bread, and a box of tea. Stanley returned an hour later, saw the bags on the table, and looked inside. What's this? My purchases, Tatiana answered, with my money for Arthur and me. What about dinner? What dinner? Well, you usually cook. Usually I cooked with joint money. Now finances are separate. Want dinner? Cook it yourself. Or order delivery with your money. Stanley frowned. Are you kidding me? I'm following your conditions. Separate finances. Remember. He wanted to say something, but changed his mind. He grabbed his jacket and left. Returned an hour later with a pizza box. Ate silently, angrily. Tatiana and Arthur had dinner in his room. She'd prepared vegetable stew for them in containers on the top shelf of the fridge, where Stanley usually didn't look. A week passed. Stanley ate frozen dinners and takeout. Once he tried to cook pasta, burned the pot, forgot to turn off the stove. Tatiana, wordlessly, washed the pot and put it back. Didn't help, didn't give advice. Stanley was angry but said nothing. He'd proposed separate finances himself. Now he was reaping the consequences. Wednesday evening, Eleanor called. Stanley, Joanne and I are coming over for dinner today, as usual. Stanley scratched his head. Mom, well, maybe not today. What do you mean, not today? We always come on Wednesdays. We've already left. We'll be there in half an hour. He hung up, looked at Tatiana. Mom and my sister are coming. So? Well, we need to set the table. Separate finances. Your guests, your responsibility. Want to feed them? Cook. Are you serious? Absolutely. Stanley was confused. 20 minutes until his mother arrived. He couldn't cook. The fridge was empty. Tatiana had moved all her products into containers on the top shelf. On the bottom shelves were only his purchases. 2 yogurts, a package of hot dogs, and a bottle of kefir. Stanley frantically tried to figure out what to do. Grabbed his phone, wanted to order delivery, but remembered his card was almost empty. He'd already spent half his paycheck on his mistress. who demanded a new phone. Damn, he cursed. Maybe you could quickly make something? No, Tatiana answered shortly. But they're coming any minute now. Your guests. You figure it out. Stanley paced around the kitchen, opening cupboards and slamming doors. Tatiana calmly finished her salad, washed her dishes, and went to Arthur's room. Closed the door. 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Stanley opened it. Eleanor and Joanne entered with familiar smiles and bags. As always, the bags were empty, formality to say we brought treats. Inside, a couple of apples and a bag of cookies. Stanley, darling. Eleanor kissed her son. I missed you so much. Joanne, take off your coat. Come in. Oh, smells delicious. What did Tanya make? They walked down the hallway as usual and looked into the kitchen, and immediately screamed at what they saw. Joanne shrieked, What is this? Eleanor froze, not believing her eyes. The table was empty. No pots, no pans, no plates, just clean tablecloth. Eleanor looked around, opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Stanley, where's dinner? Mom. Well, you see, there's this situation. What situation? Joanne walked to the stove. Nothing's cooking. The oven's empty too. Eleanor opened the fridge. The nearly empty fridge greeted her with gaping empty shelves. On the bottom, 2 yogurts and a package of hot dogs. Everything else empty. On the top shelves, containers with lids, neatly labeled T&A. On the counter by the stove were 3 packages of instant ramen. Eleanor saw them and screamed even louder. What is this, instant noodles? And the fridge is empty. Are you trying to starve us? She pulled out 1 container from the top shelf, looked inside, vegetable stew. Sniffed it, didn't touch it with her finger. Her upbringing didn't allow it. But her eyes narrowed. She put the container back, closed the fridge. Stanley, she said slowly, what's going on here? Mom. Well, we have separate finances now. I told you on the phone. Separate finances. Eleanor repeated. What is that supposed to mean? Well, everyone pays for themselves. I pay for me. Tatiana pays for herself and Arthur. So what? Joanne interjected, looking at the empty table. Food is separate too? Basically, yeah, Stanley muttered. Eleanor turned red. You mean to tell me we came all this way and nobody was planning to feed us? Mom, I didn't know you were coming. We always come on Wednesdays. 20 years, same thing. How could you not know? Joanne chimed in. Stanley, seriously? We drove across the whole city, sat in traffic, and you can't even offer us tea. There's tea, Stanley said helplessly. I can make some. I'm not talking about tea, Joanne exploded. Where's dinner? Where's the borscht, meatballs, salads? We're hungry. At that moment, Tatiana came out of the room, calm, composed. She looked at her mother-in-law and sister-in-law. Good evening. Eleanor turned to her. Tatiana, what is this outrage? We came and the table is empty. Are you mocking us? No, Tatiana answered evenly. I just don't cook anymore with other people's money. Other people's? The mother-in-law gasped. What other people's? This is family. Family, where Stanley declared separate finances. I pay for myself and my son. He pays for himself. You're his guests, so he should feed you. This is your duty, Joanne snapped. You're the wife, the homemaker. You should cook. A homemaker cooks with joint money, Tatiana calmly countered. Our money is separate, so our duties are separate. Want to eat? The store's open until 10. Or Stanley can order delivery. Stanley. Eleanor turned to her son. Are you hearing this? She's kicking us out. I'm not kicking anyone out, Tatiana objected. I'm just explaining the new rules. Separate finances, separate tables. Joanne snorted. You've got some nerve. Think just because Stanley married you, you can disrespect everyone. I think boundaries need to be respected, Tatiana replied. You come without warning. You eat and leave. You've never once brought groceries, never once offered to help, never once said thank you. And now you're outraged that I don't want to be a free cafeteria. But we're family, Eleanor protested. Family doesn't do this. Family doesn't insult other people's children, calling them burdens, Tatiana said coldly. But you did that last week. Remember? Eleanor stumbled. Joanne looked away. Stanley stared at the floor. Heavy silence hung in the air. Tatiana continued. Arthur is not a burden. He's my son, and if you want to visit this house, learn to respect him. Until then, sorry, there won't be any dinner. Eleanor turned purple. Stanley, you hear how she's talking to us? Stanley was silent. He understood he was trapped. If he sided with his mother, Tatiana would explode completely. If he sided with his wife, his mother would cause a scene. He chose a third option. He stayed silent. Great son, Eleanor said acidly. Really defended your mother. Joanne, let's go. If we're not welcome here, no point imposing. They slammed the door. Stanley stood in the middle of the hallway, confused and angry. Tatiana walked past him to the kitchen, poured herself tea. Stanley stormed in after her. What are you doing? That's my mother. Your mother insulted my son, and you stayed silent. She didn't mean to offend. She meant to, and she did. And you know it perfectly well. Stanley clenched his fists. You've humiliated me. You kicked out my family. I didn't kick anyone out. I just won't work as a free cook. You proposed separate finances yourself. Deal with the consequences. I didn't think you'd do this. And I didn't think you'd turn out to be such a hypocrite, Tatiana replied calmly. But here we are. Get used to it. Stanley wanted to say something more, but turned and went to the bedroom, slammed the door. Tatiana finished her tea, washed the cup, and went to Arthur. The boy lay on his bed with a book, but it was clear he'd heard the whole conversation. Mom, they won't come any more, he asked quietly. I don't know, Tatiana answered honestly. But if they do, they'll behave decently or they won't come at all. And Dad, I mean Stanley, is he mad? He's mad, but that's his problem. You're not to blame for anything. Arthur nodded and hugged his mother. Tatiana stroked his head and left. She sat in the living room with her laptop, opened her email, wrote to Igor. Speed up the process. Prepare the lawsuit. The next day, Stanley left for work without breakfast. Tatiana took Arthur to school and went to the office. She returned home late that evening. Stanley wasn't there. Only at 11 at night did he storm into the apartment, drunk and angry. Tatiana sat in the kitchen with tea. Stanley plopped down on the chair across from her. Are you happy? With what exactly? My mother cried all evening, called. Complained that you humiliated her. Joanne's hysterical too. They say you turned me against them. I didn't say anything. You chose to stay silent when your mother insulted Arthur. Enough about Arthur. Stanley barked. She was just joking. Strange joke, calling a child a burden. So what? He's not my son. I'm not obligated to support him. Tatiana slowly set her cup on the table, looked at Stanley with a long gaze. He continued, honestly, I'm tired. I'm putting up with you. And then there's someone else's kid on my back. Do you even understand how much money goes to him? School, clothes, food. And what? I'm supposed to pay for everything. You don't pay, Tatiana said calmly. I've always paid for Arthur. Always. You haven't spent a penny on him. Sure I have. He lives in my apartment, eats my food. In my apartment, Tatiana corrected. I bought it before our marriage with my money. Stanley faltered. Well, anyway, I pay the utilities. No, I pay the utilities. I can show you the receipts. He fell silent, realizing he dug himself into a hole, but anger took over. Whatever. I'm tired of all this. Of you, of your kid, of these stupid rules. You want separate finances? Fine. But then cook for everyone like a proper wife should. No, Tatiana said firmly. Separate finances, separate duties. Or are you canceling your decision? Stanley wanted to yell, but suddenly changed his mind. He waved his hand. Do what you want. I don't care. He got up and, swaying, went to the bedroom. Tatiana stayed in the kitchen. She took out her phone, opened her messages with Igor. Coming tomorrow. Let's sign the lawsuit. Another week passed. Stanley hardly appeared at home. He stayed at friends, as he explained. Actually at his mistress's. Tatiana knew. She didn't make scenes, didn't hash things out, just continued living her life. She cooked for herself and Arthur, went to work, met with her lawyer. The divorce papers were almost ready. She just had to wait for the right moment to serve them to Stanley. Saturday morning, the doorbell rang. Tatiana opened it. Eleanor stood on the threshold, alone without Joanne. Her face looked tired, worn, without the usual aplomb. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. Tatiana silently stepped aside. Eleanor walked to the kitchen, sat on a chair. Tatiana put the kettle on, got out cups. The silence dragged on. Finally, her mother-in-law spoke. "I wanted to, apologize for what I said about Arthur. Didn't think," said it in the heat of the moment. "In the heat of the moment," Tatiana repeated. "So, you didn't think about what you were saying." "Well, I thought it was just conversation. Didn't think you'd be offended." Arthur might be offended. He heard. Eleanor winced. "I'm sorry, really. Won't do it again." "Okay," Tatiana nodded. "I accept the apology. What else?" "Well," the mother-in-law nervously picked at the edge of the tablecloth. "I wanted to ask, maybe we could go back to how things were? We'll come over like before. You'll cook. Stanley said you earn well, so you won't go broke." Tatiana smirked. "Won't go broke, but I won't cook for you anymore either." "Why?" "Because of separate finances. Stanley proposed it himself. I agreed. Now the rules are the same for everyone. But that's silly. Family doesn't do that. Family doesn't insult children, doesn't call wives freeloaders, doesn't spend money on mistresses." Tatiana calmly listed. Eleanor jumped up. What mistresses?" "Stanley has had a mistress for 6 months. He's renting her an apartment, buying her gifts with money he supposedly spent on family." Her mother-in-law went pale. "You're lying." "I'm not lying. I have proof, photos, messages, receipts. Want to see?" Eleanor silently shook her head, sat back on the chair. She looked small now, confused. Tatiana poured her tea, set the cup in front of her. Her mother-in-law wrapped her hands around the cup, but didn't drink. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "Really didn't know. Now you do. And what are you going to do?" "Divorce. Filing next week." Eleanor flinched. "Divorce? But maybe it can still be fixed? Talk to him." "No," Tatiana said firmly. "Too much has been said. Too much done. Arthur was insulted. I was humiliated. Stanley cheats. This isn't a marriage. It's an empty shell. But he's my son. But not my husband. Not anymore." Eleanor finished her tea, set the cup on the table, stood up slowly as if she'd aged 10 years in those minutes. She walked to the door, turned around. "Forgive me, Tanya, for everything. I really didn't mean. I've forgiven you for myself, but not for Arthur. You need to apologize to him." Her mother-in-law nodded and left. Tatiana closed the door behind her and leaned against the doorframe. She sighed. Almost done. The final act. Sunday evening, Stanley came home sober but grim. Without saying a word, he went to the bedroom, changed, came out to the kitchen. Tatiana sat at the table with documents. Stanley sat across from her, looked at the papers. "What's this?" "Divorce papers." He froze. His face went pale, eyes widened. Tatiana handed him the folder. Stanley took it, opened it, scanned the lines, put the folder down, looked at Tatiana. "Are you serious?" "Absolutely." "But why?" Because of that fight? Because of separate finances? Because of everything? Because of the lies, the cheating, the disrespect for my son? Because you think I'm a fool who doesn't notice where you spend money? Stanley jerked. What cheating? What are you talking about? Tatiana pulled photos from the folder. Stanley with a girl on the street, near a building, in a cafe. Messages printed on sheets. Receipts from restaurants, stores, beauty salons. Stanley looked at it all, and his face grew grayer. Where? He croaked. I have my sources. I've known everything for 6 months. I know you're renting her an apartment. I know you're buying her gifts. I know you're spending money I gave you for the family. I know you proposed separate finances, so you wouldn't have to share with me and could spend more on your mistress. Stanley opened his mouth, but found no words. Tatiana continued calmly, methodically. You thought I wouldn't notice? Thought I'd stay silent and endure? No, Stanley. I'm not a woman who endures. I'm one who calculates, plans, and acts. And now you're getting what you deserve. Tatiana, listen, he began, but she raised her hand, stopping him. Be quiet. Listen to me. The apartment we live in is mine, bought before marriage. You have no rights to it. The downtown properties I rent out are mine, inherited before marriage. The business I run is mine, created before marriage. By law, you get nothing. No prenup, but the property is separate. Stanley listened, and his eyes filled with horror. Tatiana continued mercilessly. Moreover, the office where your company works is my property. I rent it to your employer. If I want, I'll terminate the contract. Your company will move out. You'll be out of a job. You can't, Stanley muttered. I can and will if you try to obstruct the divorce, if you try to claim alimony or compensation. If you say one word to hurt Arthur, I'll destroy you legally, financially, and morally. Understood? Stanley was silent. He sat hunched, small and pathetic. Tatiana stood up, gathered the documents. Tomorrow I'm filing. In 2 months, the divorce will be finalized. You can stay here until the end of the month, then move out. Or you can leave today. I don't care. She left the kitchen, leaving Stanley alone. He sat staring at the table, tears running down his face. Tatiana went to Arthur's room. The boy was doing homework, but looked up when his mother entered. Mom, is it true? You're getting divorced. Yes, son. Because of me? No, because of him. He turned out not to be the person I thought he was. But it's not your fault. Never was, never will be. Arthur nodded, hugged his mother. Tatiana stroked his head, kissed the top of it, left the room, and heard Stanley muttering something in the kitchen. She went back in. He sat with his head in his hands. Tatiana, forgive me, he said hoarsely. I'm an idiot. I ruined everything. Forgive me. Let's start over. I'll leave her. I'll change. I'll be different. No. Please, I'll get on my knees. I love you. You love comfort. You love money. You love being taken care of, but you don't love me. Never did. That's not true. It is, and we both know it. Stanley sobbed loudly. Tatiana looked at him without pity. She'd spent too much time to pity him now. Stanley fell to his knees, crawled toward her, trying to grab her hand. She stepped back. Tatiana, I'm begging you. Give me a chance. I'll change. I'll value you and Arthur. I'll apologize to him. I'll tell Mom to stop interfering. I'll do everything, just don't leave. I'm not leaving. You're leaving. From my apartment, from my life, from my son's life. No. Please. Tatiana turned and left. Stanley stayed on the floor, sobbing and begging into emptiness. The next day, Tatiana filed the lawsuit. Stanley tried calling, writing, came to the office. She didn't respond. Igor handled all communication. A week later, Stanley moved out of the apartment, took his things, and left. Eleanor called once, asked for forgiveness, cried on the phone. Tatiana listened, said she held no grudge but wouldn't restore relations. Joan didn't call at all. 2 months later, the The divorce was finalized. Tatiana received all the documents, stamped and signed, walked out of the courthouse, and felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Arthur met her at home with flowers he'd bought with his allowance. Tatiana hugged her son and cried, not from grief, but from relief. Another month later, she learned Stanley had lost his job. His company had indeed moved out of the rented space, not because Tatiana terminated the contract, but because the owners decided to relocate offices to another district. Stanley couldn't find new work quickly, went into debt. His mistress left him. She went to another man, more solvent, more stable. Stanley tried to return, wrote Tatiana long messages, called at night, waited by the office, begged for a second chance, promised to change, become different, value, respect, love. Tatiana read the messages, listened to voicemails, watched him stand below her windows, and felt nothing. No pity, no anger, no satisfaction. Just emptiness where feelings used to be. She blocked his number, wrote to office building security not to let him on the property. Stanley disappeared from her life. Arthur went to a new school where no one knew him. There he got into programming, started participating in competitions, winning prizes. He found friends, equally passionate about computers, smart, well-read. He started smiling more, stopped flinching when the doorbell rang. Tatiana saw how he straightened his shoulders, spoke more confidently, matured, and she rejoiced at this more than any certificates or awards. The main thing was that he stopped being afraid, stopped considering himself a burden, believed in himself. Her business grew too. She opened a second office, hired more specialists, expanded the staff to 40 people, one attender to design a major shopping center. New orders came, new clients. Money flowed. She bought Arthur a new laptop for programming, powerful, professional, enrolled him in courses with the best teachers. They traveled together to Europe for 2 weeks, visited museums, galleries, ancient castles. Arthur was happy. Tatiana was too. Life fell into place. Without Stanley, without his relatives, without lies and humiliations. In the morning, Tatiana woke up in her bed alone, and it was a relief, not loneliness. She had breakfast with Arthur, discussed plans for the day, joked. She'd take her son to school, go to work. In the evening, they'd return home together, have dinner, talk. No one criticized, nitpicked, or accused. No one came to freeload, no one insulted Arthur. Just the two of them, calm, quiet, happy. Once, 6 months after the divorce, Tatiana ran into Eleanor at the store. Her mother-in-law walked past with a cart, saw Tatiana, stopped. They stood facing each other, silently. Eleanor looked older, tired, with dimmed eyes, dressed modestly without her former gloss. Tatiana nodded to her, was about to walk past, but her mother-in-law suddenly said quietly, "You were right. Forgive us. We didn't understand what we were doing. Stanley, he's completely lost. No job, no money, alone. I tried to help, but he won't listen. He drinks now. Not every day, but he drinks. And I blame myself. That I spoiled him. That I didn't teach him to respect women. That I didn't stop him when I should have." Tatiana listened and thought these words should have been said earlier, when something could still be changed. Now it was too late. She nodded. "I forgave long ago, but that doesn't mean I want to return to that life. Forgiveness isn't an obligation to endure further. It's just releasing resentment." Eleanor nodded, wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. She wanted to say something more, but changed her mind. They parted ways, never met again. Tatiana didn't feel anger, but she didn't feel pity either. She simply closed that chapter of her life and moved on. Arthur grew up, got into university on a scholarship, became a programmer, got a job at a major company, started earning. Tatiana looked at her son and understood she'd done everything right. She didn't endure, didn't forgive the unforgivable, didn't sacrifice herself for someone else's comfort. She protected herself and her child, and that was her victory. Stanley never found himself. He worked here and there, married that same mistress, divorced a year later, started drinking, but somehow pulled himself together. Once he wrote Tatiana a long letter asking forgiveness for everything. She read it, but didn't respond. The past stayed in the past. She built a new life where she was happy, without men who called her child a burden, without relatives who only came to freeload, without lies and pretense. Tatiana closed her laptop, looked out the window. Outside was the city evening lights life. Many years had passed. Arthur had long since grown up, graduated university, become a successful programmer, and she still ran her business. Everything was as she wanted. She never once regretted not forgiving Stanley when he begged on his knees. Because forgiveness isn't weakness or kindness. It's a choice.